Good afternoon, students. Today is Friday, 17 September 2021. This may well be the last video lecture I ever do. It all depends on how things go with regard to the pandemic. But as you know, we will be back in the classroom on Tuesday, which is 4 days from now, on the 21st of September, Tuesday, at our regularly scheduled time, which is 9:30. If you look at the syllabus, you'll see that our regular class period is 9:30 to 10:50 in the morning, Tuesday and Thursday. So I'm expecting to meet with you twice next week, on Tuesday and again on Thursday. Now, UTA may at any point change things. UTA may, if the pandemic gets any worse, UTA could go back to half density, which technically we've been on since the semester began, or we could even go back fully online if it gets really bad. But I'm going to assume, going forward, that we'll be back in the classroom the way we were all the previous years of my teaching career. Okay, so this may be the last time I come upstairs at my house and record a video. The exam for this class, the first exam, is on the 28th of September, which is 11 days from today. That's a Tuesday. I'll tell you a little bit more about the exam as it gets closer. On Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, the 21st of September, I will be posting on Canvas what I call a sampling of examination questions. I've mentioned that to you at least once. The purpose of that is to show you the kind of questions that you can expect to see on the exam. There have been a few items posted since we last met. Besides the reading by William Rowe, here again is my copy, all marked up. Make sure you have that out handy when you're watching my videos or when you come to class starting Tuesday. I also posted my lecture notes for Rowe. And I need to mention something. I believe I mentioned it the other day when we met on video. I revised my lecture notes shortly after posting them, so you need to print the revised version of the lecture notes. And the way to know that they're revised is the revised notes have the date 15 September. 15 September. I believe the original version of my lecture notes had a date before that, like the 14th perhaps. So sorry about that. If you printed the original version, you'll need to recycle those sheets and print the revised version. And you can then follow along. In fact, if you haven't done that yet, why don't you pause the video right now, go print the revised lecture notes, and then come back so that when you're watching my video, you can follow along. I'm going to be going through my revised notes today. Other postings are an optional reading, which is an interview with William Rowe. Again, it's optional. I recommend that you read it, but I won't test you on it. Another item that I've posted in the recent days is entitled Mackey and Rowe on the Problem of Evil. Now, we're done with Mackey's essay from 1955. We spent 2 days on it. There were some handouts to help you understand it. And I'm sorry, I don't think I had a handout for you other than my lecture notes on Mackey. Anyway, this handout will be discussed with you next week sometime. I want to put it off until we've already covered Rowe's argument from evil, and then we'll compare the two arguments. How does Mackey's argument from evil differ from Rowe's argument from evil? And how are they alike? So that's the purpose of that handout. So make sure you print it, have it ready at hand when we meet next week on Tuesday. And the final item that I've posted is entitled Arguments and Argument Forms in William Rowe's essay. I posted it yesterday. It's a big diagram, and the purpose of the diagram is to put a lot of information in there in one place for you. On Tuesday in the classroom, we'll be talking about what Rowe calls the G.E. Moore shift. And so I want to make sure you understand that technique. And that's the purpose of the handout. So always, when you check Canvas, which you should do every day, when you see a new item, print it immediately, punch holes in it, put it in your notebook, and read it. And then in my lecture, I will often refer to it or spend some time discussing it with you. Okay, so that's the postings. You'll notice that Rowe's essay, while not long, is divided up into 3 sections. There's a short introduction, followed by Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3. Since we have 3 days on this essay, I'm going to devote all of today to section 1. We will devote Tuesday's class to section 2, and on Thursday we will wrap things up. There's also a follow-up essay by Rowe that I'll be posting today or tomorrow. It's entitled Friendly Atheism Revisited. So once we're done with this first article by Rowe, we will read and discuss the second article. Okay, it's entitled Friendly Atheism Revisited. And it contains some interesting comments on Rowe's own background and upbringing. It shows how Rowe went from being a theist to being a prominent atheist. And so even though he's an atheist, he's what he calls a friendly atheist. And there's a technical meaning to that term, which we will discuss next Thursday. And that's the last day before the exam. Okay, ready to get started? So one more comment. Please, before you come to class Tuesday to hear my lecture, please have read at least sections 1 and 2 of Rowe's essay. Okay, that's what I'll be covering on Tuesday, section 2. So let me turn to my lecture notes. Again, if you haven't printed out the revised version of my lecture notes, pause the video right now, go print the lecture notes, bring them back, and follow along as I proceed. Okay? I moved my camera, so let me get it straightened out. Okay, let's begin. Now, these lecture notes were prepared for me so that I could make sure that I cover everything that I want to cover. I will read some of it as we go along, but I'll also stop and make comments. So let me make a few introductory comments based upon Rowe's short introduction. First, I'll tell you a little bit about Rowe. William Leonard Rowe, born in 1931, died in 2015, just 6 years ago, which means he lived, 84 years. He lived either 83 or 84 years. He had a long, productive life as a philosopher. In this essay, which is quite famous, Rowe asks and tries to answer 3 interrelated questions. Those are his words, interrelated questions. He says that on page 335 of his essay. Now, why exactly are they interrelated? We'll have to hold off on that and come back to that question when we get to Thursday next week. Excuse me. When we discuss the final section of his essay, we'll be in a better position to see how the 3 questions are interrelated. Each part of his article, part 1, part 2, and part 3, takes up one of those 3 interrelated questions. Before Rowe asks and tries to answer the first question, he defines his terms, and that's a good thing. When you read an article by a philosopher or a book, it's always nice when the philosopher explains right up front how the various words will be used, because some words, as you know, have more than one meaning. Those words are said to be ambiguous. So if a word being used by the philosopher has more than one meaning, then the philosopher needs to tell you, the reader, which particular meaning is being assigned to that word or phrase. In other words, the philosopher needs to disambiguate, take away the ambiguity. Some words are vague. Some words are not sharp or clear. And so the philosopher in a case like that needs to sharpen the word and tell you precisely what that word means going forward. So Rowe defines terms right off the bat, and then he distinguishes between two forms of the problem of evil. And he calls these two forms the logical problem of evil, and that, as you might guess, is the problem that was discussed by Mackey, John Mackey. And there's also what Rowe calls the evidential problem of evil. And so Rowe thinks that his argument from evil is different from Mackey's. And by the time we finish with Rowe's essay, I will have explained to you exactly how they're alike and how they're different. Also, my handout is designed to explain that to you. Now, let's begin with Rowe's definitions of the key terms. You'll notice that the terms theist, atheist, and agnostic are used at various places in this essay. And also the corresponding terms theism, atheism, and agnosticism. So these terms are used in different ways by different people. So Rowe has a duty to his readers to tell them exactly what he means by these terms. And the first and main thing that he says, by way of defining these terms, is that these terms, each of them, has a narrow and a broad meaning. So let me use Rowe's own words to explain the difference. Let me begin with broad theism. Okay, broad theism. On page 335, Rowe writes the following. By a theist in the broad sense, I mean someone who believes in the existence of some sort of divine being or divine reality. The key words are some sort, right? So it leaves open exactly what kind of being or reality is believed in by the theist. Let's call that broad theism. And you'll see when we define the term narrow theism that one of them is included in the other one. So here is Rowe's definition of the term narrow theism. He writes on page 335, by a theist in the narrow sense, I mean someone who believes in the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, eternal, supremely good being who created the world, unquote. Now, there's a lot packed in there, so let me give you a brief explanation of each of those terms. Omnipotent, that's a term we've used already when we discussed Mackey's essay. Omnipotent means roughly all-powerful, powerful in every way. Omniscient, notice it has that same prefix, omni. Omni means all or all-encompassing, having to do with everything. Scient, which is the second part of the word, is the root of the word science. And in Latin, the word science means knowledge. So put it together. Omni and scient, it means all-knowing. Omniscient, which is how you pronounce the word, is a being who is all-knowing, who knows everything. Everything that is true is believed to be so by this being, and nothing that is false. Now that would be a pretty impressive characteristic. I wish I were omniscient. I'm sure you do as well. But unfortunately, we're not. We know certain things, but not others. And some of us think we know things when in fact they're false, so we don't really know them. We think we do, but we don't. God, this being that we're talking about, is said to be all-knowing. And let's just use the word omniscient for that. Third, eternal. God, unlike us, doesn't exist just for a particular period of time. God exists always and everywhere. So eternal means existing at all times and perhaps all places. We could add that as well. God is supremely good. We talked about that in connection with Mackey's essay. Mackey often used the term wholly good. Rowe prefers supremely good. And finally, this being who is believed in by the narrow theist is a being who created the world and therefore everything in that world. Now, many of you will recognize these qualities as being possessed by the God you believe in. If you're a theist, you may say, this is the kind of theist I am. I am someone who believes in the existence of a being with all of these characteristics. Others of you may disbelieve in such a being. There may be some of you who say, I believe that there is no such being, and that would make you an atheist in the narrow sense. Some of you may be neither a theist nor an atheist. You may not believe that a being of this sort exists, but also you may not believe that there is no such being. So you neither believe that there's a being with these characteristics, nor do you disbelieve that there's a being with those characteristics. Instead, you are in a state of doubt. We can call that agnosticism. An agnostic is someone who neither believes nor disbelieves. Now, what is the relation between a broad theist and a narrow theist? Well, the broad theist believes in some sort of divine being or divine reality, but not necessarily a personal being with all of the traits that we just went over, like omnipotence. So clearly, now listen carefully, if you are a narrow theist, you are also automatically a broad theist. Do you see that? Think of these classes as being circles, and there's one circle drawn inside the other circle. Okay? So narrow theism is a small circle drawn inside of a larger circle, which would be broad theism. So that's the way to think of these two types of theism. One of them is enclosed within the other. So obviously, if you're a narrow theist, if you believe that there's something inside the small circle, clearly you also believe that there's something inside the big circle. You see that? So we could say that narrow theism entails broad theism. And by entails, I mean guarantees. If you are a narrow theist, you are guaranteed to be a broad theist as well. But it doesn't go the other way. Broad theism does not entail narrow theism. So that means you could be in the donut part of the circle, which is the part inside the big circle, but outside the little circle. You could believe that there's something in there without believing that there's something in the small circle. So here's how you should think of it. Narrow atheism entails broad theism, but broad theism does not entail narrow theism. That's the relation between the two types of theism. Okay, and I'm going to come back in a moment to some other entailments and possibilities. Notice in my notes, I'm kind of talking to myself or reminding myself. I wrote, use circular diagrams to show the relation between the two types of theists, and point out that so defined, or defined in that way, one can be, like Paul Tillich, both a narrow atheist and a broad theist. Rowe says that Paul Tillich, who was a great theologian, a Christian theologian, well, a theologian, let's put it that way. Paul Tillich was a broad theist. He believed that there's some sort of divine being or divine reality. But he denied that there is a personal God. So if you want to draw a picture of what Tillich believed, draw the typical diagram with a big circle and a small circle enclosed within it. You should shade the small circle. Now, shading in a diagram like this means it's empty. So Tillich said there's nothing in the small circle. In other words, he's a narrow atheist. He's asserting that the small circle is empty. That's why it's shaded. But he believes that there is something in the donut part area of the diagram, the part outside of the small circle, but inside the big circle. So Tillich was an interesting creature, wasn't he? And that shows you that as Rowe has defined these terms, you can, as odd as this may sound, you can be both a theist and an atheist. Not in the same sense, of course, that would be a contradiction, but you can be a broad theist at the same time that you are a narrow atheist. And Paul Tillich is an example of someone like that. You'll notice in my notes, I give you some information. Rowe knows a lot about Paul Tillich. In fact, he knows a lot because he wrote a book about him. Rowe's PhD dissertation at the University of Michigan in 1968, it was before that, but it was published in 1968. Rowe's PhD dissertation was entitled Religious Symbols and God, a philosophical study of Tillich's theology. So Rowe is using as an example someone he knows well. And we can take his word for it. Even if you haven't read one word of Tillich, and I'm not sure I have, frankly, we can take Rowe's word that Tillich, this theologian, was a broad theist but a narrow atheist. Okay, now Rowe goes on to stipulate that throughout the rest of this article, he will be using the terms theist, atheist, and agnostic in the narrow sense. He's just stipulating that. That means he's telling you, I am going to use the words in this narrow way throughout the rest of my essay. So keep that in mind as you read it. Why then did he distinguish between broad and narrow atheism if he's going to stick with one of the two throughout the essay? It's because he didn't want you to be confused, right? Once you make a distinction, as he did, you can then stipulate that you're going to use the words in only one of those two ways in the remainder of the article. So Rowe is a wonderfully competent, a highly skilled philosopher. Whether you agree or disagree with Rowe about the existence of God, I think you'll come away from reading this essay with a certain amount of respect, even admiration for William Rowe. He was well liked by his colleagues. He was congenial. He wasn't a militant atheist. He had great respect for his colleagues who believed in God. He even co-authored a famous textbook with one of his theistic colleagues from a different university, William Wainwright. So Rowe was an interesting character. He grew up believing in God. He eventually abandoned belief in God and became an atheist. He spent much of his career defending atheism, as he's doing in this article, and yet he never lost his respect for theists and his friendliness toward them. Okay, now in my notes, I want you to see that there are other entailments and other possibilities. Now, in my lecture notes, I was unable to make circular diagrams. So if you don't mind, I'm going to hold up my lecture notes as close as I can to the camera so that you can see them. You could even pause the video so that you can take a close look at it. So let me put my notebook down so that I can take the sheet of paper out. Okay, here's the first of two entailments. Now there may be more, but these are the two main ones that I want to bring to your attention. We've seen a moment ago that you can be a a few minutes ago, that narrow atheism entails broad theism. Now what that means is if you believe that there's something in the small circle, that's what makes you a narrow theist, then by putting an X in that small circle, you're automatically putting an X in the big circle, because the small circle is completely enclosed by the large circle. It's completely contained within it. So I'm about to show you a picture of what I just said. Take a look at the top diagram. See it right there where my finger is? I'll cover the other one up. Notice I've got a large circle with a small circle inside of it, and I put an X in the small circle. That X means there's something in there. Right? The person is saying there's something in there. And that's what makes that person a narrow theist. Notice that when you put an X in that little circle, you automatically have put one in the large circle. So that's a picture of the claim that narrow theism entails broad theism. But notice it doesn't go the other way. I'm not saying that broad theism entails narrow theism. That clearly is false. Okay, here's the second of the two entailments. Broad atheism entails narrow atheism. Now for this one, I'm going to direct your attention to the second diagram. See where my finger is pointing? Notice I've got the same diagram. I've got the large circle with the small circle inside of it. And this time I shaded the large circle, all of it, because that's broad atheism. A broad atheist says there's no divine being, no divine reality. The whole big circle is empty. That's what the broad atheist says. Now notice, when you shade the whole large circle, you automatically shade the whole small circle. So if you're claiming that the big circle is empty, you're automatically claiming that the small circle is empty. And that's what I mean when I say broad atheism entails narrow atheism. Not the other way around, though. You can be a narrow atheist, like Tillich, without being a broad atheist. Okay, I'm going to leave agnosticism aside. We could go on with it and ask what are the entailment relations between different types of agnosticism, but I think that's enough to give you an idea of what this entailment relation is all about. And that may very well be an exam question. So make sure you study this carefully and understand it. If you don't understand it, send me an email or ask me immediately before or after class on Tuesday. Okay, the next part of my lecture notes is entitled Some Possibilities. Now, we were just looking at entailments. What are the possibilities in terms of somebody being able to be one thing and also some other thing? I've got 3 examples of this. There may be more, but these 3 are enough. At the very bottom of my first page of lecture notes, you'll notice that I say the following. Broad theism is compatible with narrow atheism. And I wrote the word Tillich in there because he is the example of this, or an example of this. So this time, I made the following diagram. Notice, in this diagram, let me get closer, I've got the same diagram with the same 2 circles drawn in the same way. This time, I've shaded the small area, which is narrow atheism. And I put an X in the remainder of the big circle, the part that's not shaded. You can see that's entirely possible, isn't it? There's no contradiction at all. A contradiction would be where the very same area is shaded and has an X in it. And there's nothing like that in this diagram. There's no contradiction. And because there's no contradiction, this is a possibility. What this shows you is that you can be a narrow atheist, but a broad theist. See the X in the big circle? That means you believe that there's something, some divine being or divine reality, although you deny that it's a personal God who is omnipotent and omniscient and so on. So that's what Paul Tillich's diagram looks like. And maybe it's what your diagram looks like. Maybe you agree with Tillich. Okay, turn the page. I've got 2 more possibilities with diagrams. At the very top of page 2 of my lecture notes, you'll see that I wrote, broad theism is compatible with narrow agnosticism. Now, how should we depict agnosticism in a diagram like this? We don't want to put an X somewhere, because when you put an X in a diagram, you are asserting that there's something in that area. When you shade an area, you are denying that there's something in that area. And as I explained a few minutes ago, an agnostic neither asserts the existence of something nor denies the existence of something. So for an agnostic, we want to leave the area alone. It will have neither an X in it nor shading in it. So let me go back to what I just said. Broad theism is compatible with narrow agnosticism. So here is the diagram for that. Notice I've got the same basic diagram with the two circles, and this time the only mark is an X in the donut-shaped part. You see that? What does that mean? That's somebody who believes that there is a divine being or divine reality. That's why there's an X in the big circle. But this person is agnostic about whether there's anything in the small circle. So this person, I don't have an example for you, but it's a possibility. This person says, I don't know whether there's something whether there's a being, a personal God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and so on. I simply don't know. I don't believe it, which is why there's no X in the diagram, but I don't disbelieve it either, which is why there's no shading in the diagram. So I left the small circle with nothing in it. That means it's left open. It makes no claim either way. And yet there's an X in the donut-shaped area. So that would represent somebody, and there may well be people like this, maybe you're one of them. You believe there's some sort of divine reality, but your mind is open as to whether that divine being is omnipotent, omniscient, a person, and so forth. Okay, the final possibility is as follows. Narrow atheism is compatible with broad agnosticism. So here's the final diagram. See my finger pointing toward it? You can see, I hope, that it's the same diagram, no X's anywhere at all, but there is shading in the small circle. The small circle is shaded. And remember, that's someone who says that there's nothing in there. So this person, and there may well be someone like this person says, I deny that there's a personal, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God. I disbelieve in the existence of such a being. But I'm going to keep an open mind about whether there's some other sort of being or divine reality. And that's why the donut part of that diagram is unshaded. It has neither an X in it nor shading in it. That's where the person in question is keeping an open mind. That's the agnostic part of it. Okay, well, I hope that helps you to see that you can play around with these concepts: narrow and broad theism, narrow and broad atheism, narrow and broad agnosticism. And now you can see that there are entailment relations between pairs of them. And I've given two examples of that on page 1. And there are possibilities. And I've given you 3 different possibilities. There may be other possibilities, but that's enough to show you how it works. And as will often be the case in this course, a diagram is often a good way to display either a concept or relations between various ideas or propositions. So I'm using what are called Venn diagrams, V-E-N-N. Venn diagrams are being used here to depict or display the relationships between various types of theism, atheism, and agnosticism. Okay, all of that was part of Rowe's introduction. We need to move now, since time is running by quickly, we need to move to the first section of Rowe's essay. And he begins each essay, well, I begin each essay with the question. The question is from page 335. Is there an argument for atheism based on the existence of evil that may rationally justify someone in being an atheist? Unquote. That's a yes or no question. Is there an argument like that? Is there an argument that supports atheism that is based on the existence of evil, such that that argument would rationally justify someone in being an atheist? Okay, that's the first of 3 questions posed by Rowe in this essay. And it's the only one we're going to talk about today. We'll move on Tuesday in class and talk about the second question. So let's proceed through my lecture notes. I broke it down as follows. Part A, what is Rowe's answer to the question that he asked? His answer is yes. There is an argument for atheism based on the existence of evil that rationally justifies someone in being an atheist or disbelieving in God. Notice something interesting. Rowe uses different names for his argument. On page 335, he calls it the argument from evil. And what that means, when you say an argument from blank, that means the blank part is a premise. And that's your starting point. And from that premise, you proceed to fill in the other steps of the argument, including the conclusion. So Rowe calls his argument the argument from evil. On page 335, the same page, he calls it the argument for atheism. And of course, that's what it is. The conclusion of his argument is that there is no God. God does not exist. There's no personal, omnipotent, omniscient being, in other words. And it gets even more interesting. On page 336, he appears to combine those two names. He does combine them. He refers to his argument as the argument for atheism based on evil. All right, so I just want to explain the terminology. Rowe gives his own argument a name. It's an argument from evil, which means evil is one of the premises, and it has as its conclusion atheism, the proposition that there is no personal, omnipotent, omniscient God. Now, before we proceed and look at Rowe's argument, we need to make an important distinction between intrinsic evil and what I call extrinsic evil. Now, Rowe says, and you probably agree with this, that suffering, intense suffering in particular, is an evil. It's a bad state of affairs. That anyone, anywhere, at any time is suffering, especially intensely, is a bad thing. I hope you agree with that, because Rowe does not argue for that. He takes it for granted that evil is intrinsically bad. I'm sorry, not evil, pain. Pain and suffering, Rowe says, are intrinsically bad. He doesn't argue for that claim. He just takes it for granted that you, his reader, will agree with that. You could, I suppose, argue in favor of that, but I think almost everyone believes it. Maybe a few cranks or eccentrics would deny that, but the overwhelming majority of people would say yes. Pain and suffering, especially of the intense sort, are bad. They're bad in and of themselves. They're bad intrinsically. The badness is inside of them. The badness of them doesn't depend on anything else outside of them. The badness doesn't depend on the consequences of that thing. The badness doesn't depend on what other people think about it. The badness is intrinsic to it. It's part of it. And so it would seem to follow that a world with less suffering in it is, to that extent, a better world morally than a world with that amount of suffering in it. Also, a world with no suffering at all in it would be a very good world, morally speaking. There may be other things about that world that are bad, but at least it wouldn't be bad because of the suffering it contains. So, I want you to understand two different claims. The claim that pain and suffering are bad in and of themselves, and the claim that pain and suffering are bad because of their consequences, because they lead to other bad things. So let's begin with what Rowe says on page 335, and it's in my notes. Intense human or animal suffering is in itself bad and evil. Notice Rowe is using the terms bad and evil interchangeably. And so if that sounds odd to you, maybe you think evil is more than just bad, keep in mind Rowe uses the terms interchangeably. He doesn't mean anything special by evil. He just means it's bad, morally bad. Okay, intense human or animal suffering is in itself bad or an evil, even though it may sometimes be justified by virtue of being a part of or leading to some good which is unobtainable without it. What is evil in itself, and I put in brackets, I did this, i.e. intrinsically evil, may sometimes be good as a means because it leads to something that is good in itself or intrinsically good. Now, I added the italics. I italicized the words leads to. Rowe didn't, but I did, because I want to draw your attention to them. Those are the key words here. So, let me give you a homely example. I've went to the dentist recently to have a tooth pulled, and there was some small amount of discomfort. There probably would have been more if I had not been administered nitrous oxide or laughing gas. But suppose you go to the dentist because you are experiencing some pain. The procedure itself is painful, let's suppose. But if the procedure goes well, the pain involved in the procedure will eventually end, and the pain that led you to go to the dentist to begin with will end as a result of the procedure. So how would we describe that? We would say that the pain you experienced during the procedure was intrinsically bad, but it was a cause of a state of no pain. So if you look at the state of affairs at the end of the procedure, you would say it's good. It's good that I'm no longer in pain. But the procedure that led to that involved pain. So we could say that the pain of the procedure was a means to the end of good dental health and being pain-free. Why do we go to the dentist knowing that it may involve pain and discomfort? We go because we believe that as a result of the procedure, we will get rid of the pain and we will have good dental health. We'll be able to eat our food again on maybe both sides of our mouth, whereas previously we could eat on only one side because the other side caused pain. So sometimes we submit to pain in order to produce an overall better state of affairs. Sometimes evil is a means to a good end. Okay? So that's what Rowe is saying here. Let's distinguish between something being evil as a means and evil as an end. Or something being good as a means and good as an end. So once again, Rowe says, what is evil in itself may sometimes be good as a means because it leads to something that is good in itself. So the point Rowe is making, and these are my words, is that not all intrinsic evils are evil, all things considered. Sometimes an intrinsic evil, like pain, is part of a whole that is good, like good dental health from that point forward. Okay? And we would say that the pain that I experienced during the dental procedure was bad in itself or evil in itself, but it was not evil, all things considered. Because when you take all things into account, including the good dental health at the end of the process, it outweighs the evil. And that's why we submitted to it, right? We believed that the evil that you experienced during the procedure, the pain, will be outweighed by the good. Now, what if you believed that the evil of the procedure would not be outweighed by good? You would probably choose not to undergo it. What if the dentist said, you're still going to be in pain even if we follow the procedure? You might say, well, then there's no point in going forward with it, right? If I knew that the pain would go away, I would submit to it. But if the pain's not going to go away, what's the point of submitting to it? So there is a concept of necessary evils. Sometimes we submit to various evils not because we think they're good in themselves, we don't, but because we think they will lead to other things that are good that outweigh the bad things that we submitted to. Punishment, for example, this is just an analogy, punishment is sometimes said to be a necessary evil. Why do we punish people? Punishment is a harm, whether it's bodily pain being inflicted or loss of liberty or death. Right? Punishment, by definition, is harsh treatment. It's treatment no one would willingly undergo. So why do we as a society punish people who've broken laws? We don't do it because we're sadists or sadomasochists. We don't do it because we enjoy inflicting pain on people. We do it, at least in part, because we believe that by inflicting pain on wrongdoers, we decrease the likelihood of crime in the future, not only by the person we are punishing, but by other people who are deterred by learning of the punishment. People read in the paper that so-and-so was punished for a certain crime. The people who read that may decide not to commit that crime. Maybe they were thinking of it, but when they learn that it was punished, they decide not to do it. And that's good for all of us. So one common justification for punishment is that it deters people from committing crime, and that's a good thing. We're all better off for it. All right, so we can call punishment a necessary evil. Yes, it's evil. Why then do we administer it? Because it produces a greater good, a good that outweighs the evil, the badness. Or so the story goes. Now, what if we punished somebody and we knew as we did it that no good would come of it? Nobody would be deterred by it. We might call that a pointless punishment. There's no point to it. It serves no purpose. Okay? We can think of that as gratuitous punishment. And if you want, you can think of it as pointless, purposeless punishment. Okay? Now we can say the same thing about evil. Sometimes evil has a point to it, like when you go to the dentist. But there could be an evil that has no point to it. Wouldn't a good person prevent evil if he or she could do so, if that evil served no purpose? Now we're getting closer to Rowe's argument. Rowe is going to argue that a perfectly good and all-powerful God would prevent or eliminate at least those evils that are pointless. If a particular evil has a point to it, if it leads to a greater good, then God might allow it. But surely, Rowe says, surely a perfectly good and all-powerful God would not allow evils unless there's a point to them. So pointless evil would be prevented by God. God would not allow it. And if any of it somehow came into existence, God would eliminate it quickly, instantly. Okay, so let's take a look at Rowe's argument. I'm going to first of all begin with his own statement of the argument, and then I'm going to give you my streamlined or pithy version of it. And I'm going to show you how I got my pithy version of his argument. Okay, Rowe's argument has two premises and a conclusion. It's pretty short. The first premise, and this is the one he lists first, it doesn't matter which premise is listed first, but I'm going to list them in the same order Rowe does, just to avoid any confusion on your part. Premise number one, and this is from page 336 of Rowe. You can see it right here. It's on page 336, first column near the top. And so this is where I'm getting this. It's just copied directly into my notes. Okay, here it is. And I'm reading from my notes because it's taken from the essay. Rowe says, first premise, there exist instances of intense suffering, remember, for Rowe, that's an evil, which an omnipotent, omniscient being, we'll call that being God, could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Period. Now, before we move on, let's think about that. Rowe is making an existence claim in his first premise. He is saying there exists in our world such and such, so and so. What is he saying exists? Isn't he saying there exist in our world pointless evils? Evils that have no point, evils that serve no purpose. He's saying there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without losing any greater good or producing any evil greater than the evil that exists. That is a way of saying there are pointless evils in the world. Sufferings, for example, but maybe some other types as well. So the first premise of Rowe's argument is, in effect, an assertion that pointless evil exists. Now, Rowe is going to try to justify that premise, but we're not there yet. We're going to come back and look at his justification for it. Notice on my page 3 of my lecture notes, I have proposition 4. This is from my streamlined version. Notice I just kept the numbering going. Rowe's argument has premise 1, premise 2, conclusion 3. To avoid confusion, when I made my version of his argument, I used 4, 5, and 6. Okay? So premise 4 of my version corresponds to Rowe's premise 1. It's a pithy way of saying what he said there. Now let's look at Rowe's second premise. This one might not be as easy to see, so I'll explain it to you. Rowe's second premise, which is at the top of page 3 of my lecture notes, says the following. An omniscient, wholly good being, we'll call that being God, would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering or any other evil it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So what Rowe is telling you is that if there really is a being who is omniscient and omnipotent, perfectly good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, if there is a being like that, then that person would not allow any evil unless that evil were necessary for some greater good, or unless allowing that evil would preclude an even greater evil or keep an even greater evil from coming into existence. So it seems pretty clear that Rowe's second premise, he is saying two things are incompatible. God, and by God I mean this omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being, this being is logically incompatible with pointless evil. Why would a being like that allow any evil that had no point to it? You can understand a being like that allowing evil if it had some point, if it were necessary for a greater good, or to prevent an even greater evil. But what you can't understand, according to Rowe, is a being like that allowing pointless evil. That being could snuff out pointless evil if it came into existence, and could do anything to prevent it from occurring in the first place. So my way of formulating Rowe's second premise is as follows. Notice I'm reading from my page 3, it's proposition 5, premise 5. God and pointless evil are logically incompatible. And I put in parentheses another way of saying that, i.e., if God exists, then pointless evil does not exist. If God meaning omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being. If a being like that exists, then there is no pointless evil in the universe. So that's another way of to think of Rowe's claim that God and pointless evil are incompatible. Now, what follows from those two premises? Let's begin with what Rowe says follows, and then we'll look at my version. Rowe's conclusion is there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good being. In other words, God does not exist. And you'll see that's what I wrote in my version, Proposition 6. So here's what's going on. Rowe formulated his argument with two premises and a conclusion. I rephrased it to make it pithy. I tried to extract the essence of what Rowe was saying. So I'm not changing Rowe's argument. I haven't added anything to it. I haven't taken anything away from it. I've rephrased it to make it more accessible to you. It's easier to understand. But I haven't, believe me, I haven't modified anything. In fact, I ran this by Rowe, obviously before he died in 2015, many years ago. I had a handout. I think it was an early version of the handout called Mackey and Rowe on the Problem of Evil, the handout that we'll get to next week. And I think I sent an early version of that to Rowe just to see what he thought about it. And I wanted to make sure that I hadn't misunderstood him or misstated anything. And he wrote back with approval. Take my word for it. Rowe said, it's fine. Your version captures what I meant to say in my article. So you might wonder, why didn't Rowe phrase it in the pithy way that I did? Well, I don't know. Frankly, I don't know. I prefer, when I'm writing a philosophical article, to make things pithy, not inaccurate, but pithy and easy to understand. Maybe Rowe should have done both. He could have formulated it the way he did and then said, here's a pithy version of it. So I'm simply trying to help out Rowe's readers, you, by reformulating his argument in a simplified way, a streamlined way. Now notice that Rowe's argument is valid. He himself calls it valid. On page 336, here's what he writes. He says, the argument is valid. Therefore, if we have rational grounds for accepting its premises, to that extent we have rational grounds for accepting atheism. So let me go back and define validity. What does it mean for an argument to be valid? If you've had logic, you know the answer already. If you haven't had logic, I'm going to explain it to you right now. To say that an argument is valid is to say that the conclusion follows conclusively or necessarily from the premises. Okay? The conclusion of the argument, if it's valid, does indeed follow necessarily, conclusively from the premises. Another way to state it, validity means that the truth of the premises is logically incompatible with the falsity of the conclusion. Okay? Third, you could say that a valid argument is one in which the premises entail the conclusion. They entail it. That means that the truth of the premises is incompatible with the falsity of the conclusion. That's what entailment is. We saw entailment earlier, remember? Narrow theism entails broad theism. That means that the truth of narrow theism is incompatible with the falsity of broad theism. Okay, so I've given you different definitions of the term valid. Rowe says very clearly that this is a valid argument. So that means Rowe thinks that if his two premises are true, his conclusion must be true. Not is probably true, but is necessarily true. Of course, that doesn't mean his premises are true. When you say if they're true. You are not asserting their truth. So here again is what Rowe is saying so far. If my premises are true, then my conclusion is true as well. He's going to go on to argue in favor of one of his two premises, premise one. He takes it for granted that his second premise is true. And we'll come to that in just a moment. He thinks even theists will accept it. So Rowe is doing the following when we put it all together. Rowe says, my first premise is true, and here's why. He's going to try to justify its truth. My second premise is true, and even my opponents agree with that. So I don't need to argue for it. What's the point of arguing for it when everyone agrees with it? Even the people I'm trying to persuade with this argument agree with it. So I'll just leave it there. Rowe goes on to say, since my two premises entail my conclusion, and since my premises are true, my conclusion is true as well. So Rowe believes that he has two true premises, that the two premises entail his conclusion, and therefore his conclusion is true. He thinks he has established atheism. He thinks he has come up with an argument that proves the existence of atheism. Now, he admits, he's going to go on and admit that reasonable people can disagree with his claim that the first premise is true. He says, I have not proved that my first premise is true. But if it is, if my premises are true, then so is my conclusion. All right? So we'll say more about the two premises in a moment. Let's go back to what Rowe said on page 336, because I haven't addressed it yet. He says, the argument is valid, and now you know what that means. Therefore, if we have rational grounds for accepting its premises, to that extent we have rational grounds for accepting theism, which is his conclusion. So notice Rowe is saying two things. He's saying that because his argument is valid, truth is transmitted from the premises to the conclusion. He is also saying that because his argument is valid, rational justifiability is being transmitted from the premises to the conclusion. So he's saying two things. If his premises are true, then his conclusion is true. He's also saying if we are rationally justified in believing the two premises, we are also rationally justified in believing the conclusion. And that's going to be the key to this argument. Rowe shifted the focus from truth to rational justifiability. Okay? That was Rowe's achievement in this article. He shifted the focus. He created a new argument for the non-existence of God, one that shifts the focus from the truth of atheism to the rational justifiability of belief in atheism. Okay, I said a moment ago, and we need to speed this up a little bit. It's okay because if I don't get through everything in section 1 today, we still have 2 more class periods to cover it. And honestly, the first part is longer than the other 2. So if we don't quite get through the first part today, that's okay. But let's get as far as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. Let's focus on Rowe's second premise for the time being. As you can see from reading my lecture notes on page 3, Rowe thinks that theists will accept his second premise. Remember, his argument is designed to persuade not just people who already disbelieve in God. What would be the point of that? But he's trying to persuade agnostics, people who don't already believe in God, and maybe even some theists. He's trying to persuade even theists that there are rational grounds for disbelieving in God. So Rowe says to the theists in his audience, I believe you accept my second premise. So all I will have to do to make you into an atheist is persuade you to accept my first premise. Now, that's going to be a hard thing to do, as you will see. But if he could do that, then he would have come up with an argument that would persuade even theists to give up their belief in God and start disbelieving in God. So, go back to my lecture notes. Rowe thinks that theists will accept his second premise, since it, quote, seems to express a belief that accords with our basic moral principles, principles shared by both theists and non-theists. And by the way, there was a very important and very unfortunate typographical error in Rowe's article. Everybody missed it. I didn't miss it. I'm a careful reader. At some point in one of my readings, maybe the first time I read it and I thought, wait, that can't be right. And then I finally realized that is a typo. If you replaced the typo with the correction, everything made sense. Here's the typo. It's page 336, second column on the page, about halfway, a little over halfway down. Here's what appears. This premise, or something not too distant from it, is, I think, held in common by many atheists and non-theists. Now, what's odd about that is the word atheist is often synonymous with non-theist. Right? When you put the letter A in front of a word, it has the function of non. So asexual reproduction is non-sexual reproduction. Okay? So when I read that the first time, I thought, that doesn't make sense. And then I thought, could there be a typo? And I thought, maybe atheist is a typo and it should be theist. And then when you read it that way, it all makes sense, doesn't it? In fact, later on the next page, Rowe says, where is it? Oh, yes. This is supporting my claim that there's a typo. It's the first column on 337 near the top. Rowe says, so stated, 2, meaning premise 2, seems to express a belief that accords with our basic moral principles, principles shared by both theists and non-theists. So there you go, right? Clearly, on page 336, there was a typo. And it's one of those typos that's very unfortunate because it was bound to confuse a lot of people. Some of us eventually figured out that it was a typo, but maybe others did not and came away thinking, is Rowe a bad writer? Is he not thinking clearly? What is going on? Now, I never did ask Rowe about that, unfortunately. I wish I had, because it would be nice if Rowe had written back to me and said, yes, Keith, that's a typo. Thanks for bringing it to my attention, but other people have done so over the years as well. Once an article is published, there's really not much you can do to correct typos. So somebody, in fact, a lot of people let this get through. Not only Rowe had a final chance to read the galley proofs of this article before it was published. So even Rowe must be blamed for missing this. And also various editors at the journal who should have caught it. Somebody should have caught it. Okay, I went on with that because I hope you weren't confused by it. First of all, I hope you were confused by it. Because if you were confused by it, that meant you were reading carefully, and as soon as you read it, you said, that doesn't sound right. That makes no sense. And that may have led you to wonder what's going on, and you may, like me, have eventually figured out that it was a typo. So actually, I hope you were confused. If you read it and weren't confused, shame on you. You didn't read it carefully enough. Okay, what else do we want to say about the second premise? The second premise, Rowe thinks, doesn't need to be defended. Why? Because he thinks everyone agrees with it already. Even the people he disagrees with, he thinks agree with it. And for many years, I simply accepted that. But guess what? In the year 2000, which is 21 years after Rowe's article appeared in print, in the year 2000, a very good, very prominent philosopher named Peter Van Inwagen, who taught for many years at the University of Notre Dame, a philosopher. Peter Van Inwagen published an article with the interesting title, The Argument from Particular Horrendous Evils. He published it in the Proceedings of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. And you can track it down. It's available through the UTA library. I think it's in the database called JSTOR. You can track it down and read it if you'd like. And you'll find there that Peter Van Inwagen may have been the first person to reject Rowe's second premise. The second premise, remember, says that God is logically incompatible with pointless evil. Surely, Rowe says, no good and all-powerful God would allow pointless evil, maybe evil if there's a point to it, but not pointless evil or gratuitous evil. And Peter Van Inwagen says, I disagree. Respectfully, Bill Rowe, I disagree with you. I think the God that we're talking about could well allow even pointless evil. Evil that has no point. Evil that is not necessary for any greater good or to prevent an even greater evil. Now, I'm not going to say any more about it. I'm simply drawing to your attention something Rowe evidently didn't even think about when he published this. If someone had written an article like Van Inwagen's, at the time Rowe published this article, he surely would have mentioned it in a footnote. I think that Van Inwagen's article, when it appeared, blew Rowe's mind. Rowe probably thought no one would ever be so bold or crazy as to reject the second premise. Why would God, being God, allow pointless evil? That just seems incompatible with God's nature. And yet, here was a very intelligent, very creative philosopher flat out denying it. So you'll have to read Van Inwagen's article on your own if you want to see the details. Earlier in 1992, William Hasker, a Christian philosopher, had also argued, as Van Inwagen did later, that God is not incompatible with pointless evil. The title of Hasker's essay is The Necessity of Gratuitous Evil. You can see from the title what he's going to argue there. He's arguing that not only is God's existence compatible logically with pointless evil or gratuitous evil, but Hasker goes on to argue that there has to be gratuitous evil given God's existence and nature. So, as early as 1992, philosophers were suggesting that maybe Rowe's second premise is false. I think I'm going to stop here. We're an hour and 13 minutes in. We're not done with section 1 yet. We're about to look at Rowe's first premise, and that's where he tells the story of a fawn. And the main reason I don't want to go further is because I would need to quote that paragraph where he discusses the fawn and then start discussing the purpose of that example. And that's going to take way too long. We're already at the end of our time limit. So why don't we pick up in the classroom with the fawn case? And that'll be fitting, I suppose. The very first thing we discuss when we meet face-to-face in the classroom will be a very, very famous example. Rowe came up with this example. It's been much discussed in the literature. The story I've read is that when Rowe talks about the fawn in person before an audience, there are hardly any dry eyes in the house. It's a very moving story about a fawn who is very seriously burned in a forest fire, who lies in terrible agony for several days before finally succumbing to the wounds from the flames. So I'm getting a tear in my eye already. So let's stop right there. And on Tuesday when we meet in the classroom, we'll get started with that. So have a great day and a great weekend. And I guess this is a momentous occasion. I've been lecturing on video for over a year and a half. I think it was March 2020 when the university shut down and I went online completely. And even though we were supposed to do hybrid teaching for the first 7 days this semester, I decided that I would do online teaching until Tuesday. So we're going to have a big break from online exclusively to in class exclusively on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. I'll see you Tuesday.